just to be clear. Our gospel today is from St. Mark chapter 2. One Sabbath day, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to them, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read that David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger, and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. The Gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I can save you a lot of trouble, say you mostly heard the sermon, which is how this is supposed to work. As I mentioned up front, we had two choices for first readings in the lectionary today. And because of the Sabbath focus on the law in the gospel, the other first reading is from Deuteronomy chapter 5. And it says, "Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and you shall not do any work. You, or your son, or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox, or your donkey, or any of your livestock, for the resident alien in your towns, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you." That Sabbath law was there for humanity. It was for the good of humankind, all of humankind, and in fact all of God's creation, as it includes all of our livestock. It is a compassionate law. If you think about it, in the Genesis story, humankind is created on the last work day for God. So, humankind's first day in creation was the Sabbath, a day off. A good start. In the gospel that I just read, we have yet another confrontation between people who are honest, well-intentioned, educated, biblical scholars of their time, concerned about what Jesus is doing because it's different. And in the first story, as the disciples are eating and walking, the religious leaders are keyed in on that "don't you dare work" thing instead of the practicalities of life. They might also, perhaps, because they're getting very concerned about Jesus, they might have been a little fearful and looking for an angle. Just maybe. And Jesus points out there's case law to defend what the disciples just did in Scripture. Have you not read what David did? It is more important to take care of hunger and to take care of need. The second one, hard upon the first, more working on the Sabbath, and they are paying attention because they've caught on to how this guy works. They probably went out and picked this guy up with the hand and said, "Come on in." Because traditionally he would not have been welcome in worship because he was unclean. But he was there. Maybe looking for an angle. Just maybe. Because they knew that Jesus would not let this go. He would want to do something about it. His compassion would compel him to serve this man. And Jesus puts it out right there and says, what is lawful to do on the Sabbath? To bring life or to kill? And our translation doesn't say it, but they go out to conspire with the Herodians. The correct translation says, to kill him. On the Sabbath. They might have had an angle working. Because they're going to use the law for their direction. And they're doing it out of fear. Fear and law do not go well together. God gives us law to help us get the most out of life. In particular, to help us get more out of life with each other. Looking out for each other, taking care of each other. A mutual responsibility. So law creates a level of order that makes human well-being and even flourishing more likely. Law offers a measure of protection, particularly for those most in need, those most vulnerable. It establishes a baseline of stability that makes it easier for all of us to do well, to prosper, and to build on our work with one another. Which is why God's law is holy, and we're taught to revere it and to follow it. But to follow it responsibly. But as important as law is, it is a means to an end. It's in service to greater good. Following the law is not in and of itself the point of law. And using law just to identify doesn't necessarily work unless we use it to identify us as beloved children who have been given this gift. Not a weapon, a gift. But being human, and often fearful, we have a tendency to follow law as the point of the law, and to forget that it's established to help everyone. And sometimes we're tempted to use law to establish our identity based on our ability to obey God's law. Well, if not perfectly, at least better than those people. And you know who those are. It's to build it. When we use it to build ourselves up, to create an identity of superiority, we not only are not following the law, we're defeating the law. Some of you have heard me allude to the fact that reading is kind of a problem sometimes because of screwy eyeballs. And I finally gave up recently and tried an audiobook. I don't like it. I'll put that out there right now. It's not reading. But anyway, because I subscribe to this app, and so your first book is free, and I'm going, okay. And the one that grabbed me was John Meacham's new book called The Soul of America. And in the introduction to this book, Meacham says, I chose to write about the soul of America as opposed to the American creed through history, because creed is all well and good, but sometimes it's difficult to put into practice. And how we put that creed into practice is, in fact, our soul. Sound familiar? Kind of like our faith and how we put our creed into practice and our law from God. It kind of establishes our soul. But this week I discovered that Dr. David Lose, who's a pastor, theologian, somebody I follow and think a lot of, had started reading this book as well. And he was ahead of me because he started earlier and he was actually reading instead of listening to a very slow audio book. Let me tell you what he says. Meacham has helped me understand something that I've long puzzled over, as I never quite understood why Thomas Jefferson, surely one of the brightest minds and most able writers in our history, didn't reach higher when describing our unalienable rights. Life, liberty, of course, but the pursuit of happiness? That's where I've always felt Jefferson fell a little flat, wishing that he had reached for more than individual fulfillment. But, as Meacham points out, in the 18th and 19th centuries, happiness was not an individual or private matter at all. Rather, happiness was societal happiness. Or perhaps better, societal flourishing. One could only be happy in those conditions where everyone had the potential to flourish. And this is on pages 40 and 41 that I haven't gotten to hear yet. So I'm glad that Dr. Lose put it out there so I could see it, because it points up what we're looking at here. As Jesus points out in this story, he's offering a corrective on how we look at law and how we apply God's law and how we don't use it to achieve our own religiosity at our neighbor's expense. He shows how powerfully attached we are to law and how that can be a problem. Because God created us to love and support each other. God gave us law to help us do that. It's out of our insecurity, our fears, that we misuse it sometimes, even to the point of ignoring or abandoning our neighbors in need. But it's actually only when we abandon our own priorities and our own claims to righteousness and are willing to put ourselves out for our neighbors and do it above our own wishes that we live into God's dream and God's desire that all of God's children should flourish. Because that opposition that Jesus is facing here in all of these stories is fear. Fear on the part of those who realize that Jesus is calling them to do something that is not comfortable. And it's difficult because we understandably prefer safety. It's human nature. We want to feel safe. But Jesus calls us out into vulnerability. And he says, this is where we need to be going. This is what the law is all about. And then he goes about walking that path all the way to the cross. And saying, this is where this ends. No greater love has a man than to give his life for another. Whether that be giving service or giving literally one's life as Jesus did. But it goes beyond that. Because after that cross comes the resurrection. And as we keep Sabbath in our tradition, when we come together to celebrate a little Easter every week, we remember that resurrection and we remember that resurrection promise. And we remember that we're called to put the law to use for our neighbor. We also know that sometimes we won't do it as well as we probably should. But whether we falter or fail flat out, it's the effort. And the crucified and risen Christ is here now, forgiving, inviting us to move forward, loving us even when we fall short, because at the heart of the law is love. And love, in time, redeems all. Amen.